He stood in her doorway soaked, shivering, and certain his gray eyes searching her face with a tenderness that made no sense at all. "Clara," he whispered, like her name was a prayer he had been holding for years. "I finally found you." The snow had been falling for 6 hours when Clara Reeves decided the universe was personally opposed to her happiness. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the white obliterate everything: the gravel road, the fence line, the old oak she'd planted with her grandmother 12 years ago. The power had flickered twice already. The space heater in the corner clicked and hummed with the exhaustion of something overworked. The wood stove needed another log, but the logs were on the porch, and the porch was buried under 16 inches of snow, and Clara had not yet decided if warmth was worth the cold she'd have to suffer to earn it. She decided it was. She always did. That was Clara Reeves in a single image, calculating the cost of everything, deciding it was worth it, and walking out into the cold anyway. She was 34 years old, the owner of a small pottery studio in Hallow Creek, Vermont, a town so quiet that the local newspaper ran a story last spring about a particularly large pumpkin. She had a cat named Fig who tolerated her affection on a schedule known only to Fig. She had a best friend, Miriam, who called every Sunday and always asked the same question: "Any men, Clara? Any at all?" and received the same answer every time. She had the studio, the window, the snow, and the wood stove. She had a life that was small by some people's measurements and exactly the right size by hers. She had not always felt this way. There had been a time, her late 20s, a man named Daniel, when she had reached for something larger. He had taken the reaching and handed it back to her in pieces. She had reassembled herself carefully, deliberately, the way she reassembled a broken pot she loved too much to throw away. Kintsugi, the Japanese called it. Fill the cracks with gold and call it beautiful. Clara had done something similar, but she had filled the cracks with routine and solitude and the satisfying weight of clay under her hands. She was not unhappy. She was careful. There was a difference. She pulled on her coat and went out for the logs. 240 miles south, in a Manhattan penthouse that occupied the entire 48th floor of a building he owned, Ethan Croft was having the kind of morning that would have broken most men and merely annoyed him. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear, watching the city below with the blank, assessing gaze of a man who had long ago stopped seeing people and started seeing variables. The snow had reached Manhattan overnight, not the heavy pastoral kind that was burying Vermont, but a sleek, inconvenient urban version that delayed flights and ruined shoes and cost his operations an estimated $400,000 in logistical friction. "Reroute the Burlington delivery through Albany," he said, his voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. "And push the Ashford meeting to Thursday." "No, don't ask them. Tell them." He ended the call before his assistant could reply. Ethan Croft was 40 years old, the founder and CEO of Croft Capital Holdings, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers the way other men's faces appeared on wanted posters frequently and without his full consent. He was worth approximately $6.4 billion, a figure that fluctuated daily and which he tracked with the same emotional engagement most people brought to weather reports. He had a penthouse. He had a driver. He had a personal chef, a personal trainer, and a personal physician who called every Monday to ask if he had slept. He never had, but he appreciated the ritual of being asked. What Ethan Croft did not have: warmth. Not the temperature kind. The penthouse was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, but the human kind. The kind that made people lean toward each other, make room, leave lights on. He had excised that quality from himself years ago, after his father's company collapsed and took their family with it, and after Ethan rebuilt everything alone, stone by stone, and discovered that softness was a liability he could not afford. His phone rang again. He ignored it. He had a helicopter booked to Burlington at noon, a property acquisition in the Northeast Kingdom. 12,000 acres of timberland that his analysts called undervalued and which Ethan planned to hold for precisely 7 years before selling at a calculated profit. It was not a sentimental purchase. Ethan did not make sentimental purchases. The storm, his pilot had warned him, was worse than forecast. Ethan had said, "Then fly lower." 2 people, a continent of differences, and a storm that neither of them planned for. Have you ever felt like your perfectly arranged life was quietly waiting for something to shatter it? Drop a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts as the story begins. Clara heard the knock at 7:14 in the evening. She knew the time because she had been watching the clock, willing Miriam's Sunday call to come early, because the storm had pressed the walls of the cottage closer than usual, and she needed a voice that wasn't her own or Fig's. The cat had retreated under the bed hours ago and showed no signs of philosophical engagement. The knock came again. Harder. Clara set down her mug and stood very still. No one came down her road. Not in weather like this. Her nearest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile east, an elderly man named Harold Butte who had not, to her knowledge, left his house since October. The road to town was a single-lane track that flooded in spring and drifted shut in winter. She had chosen this cottage 8 years ago, specifically because it was the kind of place people did not come to by accident. And yet, she crossed to the door, lifted the curtain on the narrow window beside it, and looked out. A man stood on her porch. He was tall. She registered that first, the sheer verticality of him against the white, and he was without a coat, which was so alarming in this weather that she had her hand on the door handle before she'd made a conscious decision. He wore a dark suit, now soaked through, and dress shoes that were caked in snow up to the ankle. He had no hat, no gloves, no scarf. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by wet snow. He was shivering with the full body, uncontrolled shudder of a person whose core temperature had dropped into dangerous territory. His eyes, when he raised them, were gray, pale, winter sky gray. And they found her face through the window glass with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Not relief exactly, not surprise. Something deeper than either. Something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. She opened the door. The cold came in like a living thing. The man swayed once, caught himself on the doorframe. "Clara," he said. His voice was low and wrecked with cold. "Clara, I found you." She blinked. "I what? How do you know my name?" He looked confused. His brow creased. He glanced around as if taking an inventory of the porch, the snow-buried yard, the dark tree line beyond, and finding none of it quite matching what he expected. Then he looked back at her, and his expression softened, not into uncertainty, but into a kind of relieved certainty that made absolutely no sense. "You changed the porch light," he said. It was blue before. It had never been blue. She had lived here 8 years. The porch light had always been the same warm amber. She had never changed it. "You need to come inside," she said. She stepped back, and he followed her in. And when she touched his arm to steer him toward the wood stove, the cold of him shocked her. Not the surface cold of someone who'd been outside for minutes, but deep, penetrating, the cold of someone who had been in the storm a long time. His hands, when she pulled them toward the stove's heat, were white at the fingertips. "Sit," she said. She didn't ask questions. Questions were for later. She got the blanket from the hall closet. She got towels. She heated water for tea with the speed of a woman who knew how to respond to crisis without needing to understand it first. She stripped his jacket, and she didn't miss how expensive the fabric was, didn't miss the cut or the quality, but she set all of that aside because right now he was a person whose fingers were not pink, and that was the only relevant fact. When she pressed the mug into his hands, he looked at it, then at her. "You always made it too hot," he said softly, and something in his voice was so private, so genuinely tender, that she felt her breath catch. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "What's your name?" He looked up at her. The gray eyes were serious, steady, not frightened, not confused. "Certain. Ethan," he said. "You know who I am, Clara? I'm your husband." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind shifted and threw a fistful of snow against the window like a warning. Clara stared at the man sitting in her grandmother's chair, wrapped in her grandmother's blanket, holding her mug, claiming to be her husband. She had never seen him before in her life. She did not call the police immediately. She would examine that decision later, in the quiet privacy of her own embarrassment, and find it difficult to justify. She was a sensible woman. She knew what sensible women did when strange men appeared at their doors claiming impossible things. But there was something about him. It wasn't that he was handsome, though he was in that particular way of men who are built for authority, all strong jaw and careful posture even in hypothermia. It was the way he looked at her. Not possessively, not with the smug entitlement she might have expected from a man making such a claim. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they were afraid they'd lost. Like he was taking inventory of her face and finding, against all odds, that it was all still there. She asked him questions. He answered them, but the answers revealed a jagged, troubling landscape. "What year is it?" she asked. He hesitated. He stopped. "I know this." Another pause. "I don't know this." "What city is this?" "Vermont," he said. "You always said Vermont felt like the only real place." She had said that. She had said exactly that. To Miriam, years ago, in a phone call she'd never repeated to anyone else. The coincidence clamped cold fingers around the back of her neck, and she shook it off. Coincidences were not evidence of anything except coincidence. "Do you know your last name?" Silence. The fire shifted and settled. He looked down at his hands. The color was returning to them now, a good sign. His fingers flushed pink, and the look on his face was the most naked thing she had ever seen. It was a man confronting an absence where something solid should have been. "Ethan," he said finally. "I know I'm Ethan. I know I'm your husband. I know what you smell like when you come in from the cold." He looked up. "But I don't know how I got here. I don't know the road I walked, or how long. I was somewhere, and then I was in the snow, and then I saw the light in your window." She exhaled slowly. "You have a head injury." She moved behind him before he could protest, and found it at the base of his skull, a swelling, tender and raised, the kind that suggested impact with something solid and unforgiving. He winced when her fingers found it. She had first aid training from her years as a wilderness trail guide in her 20s, and she ran through the protocol quickly, checking his pupils, testing his coordination, assessing his speech patterns. Concussion, almost certainly, possibly more. Memory disruption consistent with what she was seeing. She reached for her phone. The screen showed one bar, flickering. The call to emergency services connected, held for 4 seconds, and then, nothing. The bar vanished. Outside, the storm pressed itself against the house with renewed intent, and the lights dimmed once, twice, and then abandoned pretense entirely. The wood stove became the only light in the room. "The road will be impassable until morning," she said, though she was speaking mostly to herself, working through it. "The power's out, which means the nearest medical service is unreachable. You have a head injury, and you're warming up, which is the right direction." She looked at him. "You're staying here tonight. I'll keep you awake and monitor for signs of serious concussion. And in the morning, when the road opens, I'm taking you to the hospital in Burlington." He nodded, and then, and this was the part that unsettled her most, he smiled. Not broadly. A small, private, deeply contented smile, as if he were a man who had been told something he already knew. "You always knew exactly what to do," he said. She looked away before the smile could do what it was doing to something behind her sternum. "I'm not your wife," she said clearly. "We've never met. Whatever you think you know about me, it's your injury speaking. I need you to understand that." "Okay," he said. He said it the way a patient adult accepts a correction they don't agree with but choose not to contest. It was one of the most aggravating responses she had ever received. Fig emerged from the bedroom and sat at Ethan's feet and stared at him with unblinking amber eyes. The cat, who had not willingly approached a human being in 3 years, then stepped forward and sat directly on Ethan's feet. Clara stared at her traitor cat and decided the universe was indeed personally opposed to her. She kept him awake by talking. This was, she realized around the second hour, a form of torture she had not anticipated, not for him, but for herself. Because the man was stripped of whatever armor amnesia had removed, unexpectedly and profoundly easy to talk to. She asked him questions to monitor his cognition. What did he remember? What could he recall? How did his head feel? Did the nausea increase? He answered everything with a directness that was almost startling. No deflection, no performance. Just a man sitting by a fire, answering honestly. He remembered fragments. Not linear memory, not his past laid out in order, but atmospheric impressions. Cold offices. The smell of leather and paper. A feeling, he said, like being very high up and very alone. He remembered numbers. He could not stop narrating numbers, figures, and calculations that came out of him involuntarily, like a man muttering in a language his body remembered even when his mind did not. 14%, he said at one point, out of silence. That's the depreciation rate on something. Something important. A building? She asked. An idea, he said. Then he blinked. That doesn't make sense. Not every thought has to, she said, and handed him another cup of tea. He asked about her. She told him carefully the studio, the pottery, the cottage. She told him about the clay, about how different soils had different temperatures when wet, about how centering a piece on the wheel required a kind of surrender that had taken her years to learn. She expected him to be polite and faintly disinterested, the way people were when she talked about her work. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching her with that focused attention of his that she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. Centering, he said, meaning you have to stop fighting the clay. Meaning you have to meet it where it is, she said. Not where you want it to be. He was quiet for a moment. I don't do that, he said. I'm fairly sure I have never done that in my life. She almost laughed. She stopped herself, mostly on principle. Around midnight, she found her grandmother's old cards in the drawer, and they played gin rummy by firelight because she needed him awake and interactive, and this was less exhausting than maintaining a conversation at full volume. He was sharply, naturally competitive. He won the first 3 hands before he appeared to notice that he was winning and then, for no reason she could identify, began losing deliberately. She caught him doing it, the slight hesitation before a discard, the choice that made no mathematical sense. You're losing on purpose, she said. He looked caught. It was the first time she had seen him look anything other than certain. A faint flush ran up the back of his neck. You were getting frustrated, he said. I was not. Your jaw does a thing when you're frustrated. You have known me for 5 hours. I know, he said. And then, quieter. I've been watching you. I can't stop. The fire made a sound like a held breath releasing. Clara looked down at her cards and did not look up for a long moment. Get some rest, she said finally. Not sleeping, just close your eyes. I'll wake you every 2 hours to check your pupils. She settled him on the sofa with her grandmother's quilt and the extra pillow from the hall closet. She sat in the chair across from him with a book she didn't read and watched the storm make itself at home outside her walls. When she looked over at him after 30 minutes, his eyes were closed and his face in repose. In firelight was entirely unguarded. He looked, she thought against her will, like someone who had been very tense for a very long time and had finally, accidentally, stopped. Some things could not be attributed to injury. Some things were just a man, seen clearly for the first time, making her wish she had worse vision. At 2 in the morning, while Ethan slept in careful intervals, Clara found the wallet. It had fallen from his jacket pocket when she'd hung the jacket by the stove to dry. She picked it up with every intention of setting it aside unopened, and then she sat with it in her hands for a long moment, because she was the kind of person who understood that information and ignorance were both choices, and that one of them was safer. She opened it. The name on the black card mat, heavy, the kind that had no credit limit printed on it, read, Ethan James Croft. She stared at it. She did not know the name Ethan Croft, but that was because Clara did not read the financial press and did not track the Forbes lists and had, on principle, a complicated relationship with the entire category of men who appeared on magazine covers in tailored suits. But she knew what the black card meant. She knew what the quality of the wallet meant. The kind of leather that didn't show fingerprints. She knew what his suit meant. Now that feeling had returned to her hands, and she could assess the weight of the fabric properly. She set the wallet aside and opened her laptop. The cellular connection was weak but functional at this hour, the storm having briefly relented from peak fury. She typed his name into the search bar. The results came back immediately and abundantly. Ethan Croft, founder and CEO of Croft Capital Holdings. Net worth $6.4 billion. Born in Albany, New York. Raised in what the profiles called modest circumstances before building, from scratch, one of the most aggressive private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard. She scrolled through the images there. He was in those magazine covers, exactly as she'd imagined, jaw set, gaze direct, the kind of man who looked at cameras the way he probably looked at everything else, as something to be assessed and then disregarded. He was not married. Every profile confirmed it. He had been linked, over the years, to various women in various contexts, but there was no wife, no ex-wife, no fiancé. He lived alone. He was known, one particularly unflattering profile noted, for a personal coldness that his professional results have rendered irrelevant. She read the last line of a more recent article. Ethan Croft was reported missing early. Sunday evening following an emergency helicopter landing in a rural area of northern Vermont during the historic blizzard. His pilot, who survived the landing uninjured, told authorities that Croft exited the aircraft before help arrived and walked into the storm. Search and rescue efforts are underway. She looked at the man asleep on her sofa. Fig had repositioned himself to rest against the curve of Ethan's knees. The firelight moved across both of them in slow waves. A $6 billion man had walked out of a crashed helicopter in a blizzard and somehow arrived at her door. At her specific door. And his injured brain, his stripped-down, architecture-free consciousness had decided, of all the things to believe that she was someone who loved him. She didn't know what to do with any of that. She crossed to the sofa and looked at him for a moment. "Who told you to come here?" she asked him quietly, not expecting an answer. His eyes opened, half-lidded. He was not fully awake, but he heard her, some animal part of him surfacing. "You did," he murmured. "You always said if I ever got lost, find the light in the window." He was asleep again before she could respond. She sat back down in her chair and pressed her hands together between her knees and breathed. She had never said that to anyone. She had never said that in her life. He walked through a blizzard and ended up at her door. She'd never said those words to anyone, and yet they felt true. Do you believe some people are meant to find each other? Or is that just a beautiful story we tell ourselves? Tell us in the comments. We're reading every single one. Morning came in stages. First a lightening of the dark, then a blue-gray dawn, then the sudden crystalline silence that follows a storm's end, that particular quiet that feels like the world taking a breath after exertion. Clara had slept in the chair for 3 hours and woken with a crick in her neck and a clarity she resented. She had woken him at 2 and 4 for pupil checks. Both times he had surfaced quickly, answered her questions correctly, and looked at her with those gray eyes in the firelight like she was the least surprising thing about his situation. Now, at 7:15, she stood at the stove and made eggs and tried very hard not to think about the man sitting at her kitchen table watching her cook. "You use too much butter," he said. "No such thing," she replied. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, "I think I normally don't eat breakfast." "Why not?" "I don't know. It feels like something I decided against." She turned to look at him. He was sitting with both hands wrapped around a mug, his shirt one of her ex-boyfriend's flannels that she'd kept for painting and which was too large even on Ethan's broad frame, open at the collar. His hair was dry now, darker than she'd first registered, with a single thread of silver at the left temple. The bruise at his skull was visible as a raised shadow, and she needed to get him to a hospital. But right now, in the morning light, with snow brilliant outside the window and butter sizzling on the stove, the urgency of that felt not diminished, but gently postponed. "People who skip breakfast," she said, turning back to the stove, "usually do it because they're moving too fast to stop." "Is that a diagnosis?" "It's an observation." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you think that's what's wrong with me?" She slid the eggs onto plates and brought them to the table and sat across from him. He looked at the plate with an expression of mild bewilderment, like a man encountering something he had forgotten was possible. "I think you have a head injury," she said carefully, "and I think you may be a different person than the one your injury remembers." He considered this seriously. She had noticed that about him. He took things seriously, not as a performance, but as a genuine habit of mind. He didn't deflect or joke away the hard angles of a sentence. He turned them over. "What kind of person do I seem like to you?" he asked. "Right now? What do you see?" She should have deflected. She should have said something practical. Instead, she told him the truth, because the storm was over and the morning was clear, and she was 34 years old, and she had filled enough cracks with gold to know the difference between self-protection and dishonesty. "Attentive," she said, genuinely curious. "A little bossy, but not unkindly. You lost on purpose at cards to make me feel better and then try to hide it, which is the act of someone who cares about how other people feel but doesn't want to be caught caring. And you have been, since you sat in that chair last night, more present in this room than most people manage to be." He looked at her. The expression on his face was something she had no name for, not surprise, not gratitude, not the particular smugness of someone who expected to be admired. It was something quieter, something that looked like being seen and not minding it. "You're very honest," he said. "I have been told it's a problem." "By who?" "People who preferred comfortable lies." He nodded slowly. I think I've been one of those. They ate their eggs. Outside, a bird landed in the snow and immediately looked outraged by the decision. They both watched it through the window, and Clara felt, for the first time and longer than she could pinpoint, the specific warmth of sharing a moment, not performing it, not narrating it, just inhabiting it alongside another person. It was exactly as dangerous as she'd suspected it would be. After breakfast, he helped her wash up, and when she handed him a dish to dry and their fingers brushed around the handle, neither of them moved away quickly. She felt the warmth of his hand against the back of her knuckles, and she thought, this is how it begins. The thing she had been so careful to prevent. The thing that started in kitchens, in ordinary mornings, in the space between passing someone a dish towel and the moment they took it. I need to tell you something, she said. She told him. All of it. The wallet, the name, the search results, the article. She told him he was worth $6 billion and lived alone in a Manhattan penthouse and had been missing from a helicopter crash since yesterday evening. She set her phone on the counter so he could read the article himself. He read it. His face was very still. When he looked up, something had shifted in his eyes. Not the warm certainty of the night before. A new expression, careful, measuring, the first hint of the man in those magazine covers. I see, he said. I'm sorry, she said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Don't be. He set the phone down. It doesn't change last night. It changes what last night was, she said. You thought I was your wife. I'm a stranger who found you in a snowstorm. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the look was complicated, the certainty in conflict with the new information. Two truths in a room that was only large enough for one. You don't feel like a stranger, he said. She handed him a coat from the hall closet, her ex's again, because it was the only one large enough, and picked up her keys. Burlington, she said. Hospital. Now, Burlington General was controlled chaos when they arrived. His assistant, a razor-sharp woman named Diane who had clearly not slept, materialized in the lobby within 40 minutes of Clara's call. Two security men arrived shortly after. A physician was waiting. And then, by the second hour, a man who introduced himself as Croft Capital's head of legal counsel appeared and stood near Ethan with the particular territorial alertness of someone whose job description included human asset protection. Clara watched all of this from a chair in the corner of the waiting area. She had brought a book. She did not read it. She watched the world that belonged to Ethan Croft assemble itself around him with the practiced efficiency of something that had always been there, waiting for him to return to its coordinates. She watched him receive it, not coldly, exactly, but with a formality that was as different from the man at her kitchen table as a photograph is from the person it depicts. The CT scan showed no bleed. The neurologist said the amnesia was concussive and temporary, most likely to resolve within 24 to 72 hours, possibly in stages. The swelling at the base of his skull was significant, but not critical. He had been extraordinarily lucky, the doctor said, to have found shelter when he did. Another hour in those temperatures would have been a different story entirely. Clara told the doctor what she'd observed overnight. The doctor thanked her with professional warmth and asked if she needed anything. She said she was fine. Ethan was in the examination room for an hour. When he came out, Diane was beside him and the legal counsel was on his other side, and he was wearing a hospital-issue shirt that sat oddly on his frame, and he looked. Clara searched for the word. He looked recomposed. Like a man who had been briefly and uncharacteristically open and had now, with access to his context, closed again. He crossed the waiting room to where she sat. Up close, the openness was not entirely gone. She could see it behind the professional composure, a residue, like warmth in a room after the fire's been banked. They tell me you kept me alive, he said. Basic first aid, she said. Anyone would have. Not anyone would have let me in. She acknowledged that with a small nod. He reached into a pocket. Someone had located his second phone, the one Diane apparently always kept for emergencies, and said, I'd like to have your information, to be in touch. 2. You don't have to do that, she said. I want to. She looked at him. The gray eyes were steady, but she could see the effort in them, the small, private war between the man who had woken up in her chair by the fire and the man who had 40 people waiting for him and a $6 billion obligation to get back to being himself. Your memory will come back, she said gently. When it does, last night will feel different. It'll feel like a confusion, a symptom. You'll want to put it in the category of things that happened to you and move on. You sound very certain. I'm being practical. I've been told I'm practical too, he said. Apparently, it's a problem. He was using her own words. She felt something tighten in her chest, something that was not quite grief, but shared a border with it. Take care of yourself, Ethan, she said. She picked up her bag and walked out of the hospital into the clean, post-storm air, and she did not look back, because she was a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, that looking back was a luxury she couldn't always afford. She drove home. The road was plowed and salted and perfectly ordinary. She went to the studio and sat at her wheel, and put her hands in clay and tried to find the center, the way she always did, that place where the spinning stopped fighting and became something purposeful. The clay was cold and uncooperative. She couldn't center it. She kept starting again. She did this for 2 hours before she accepted that the problem was not the clay. His memory returned on a Tuesday. Ethan had been told to expect it. The neurologist had described it as a gradual surfacing, like an image developing in solution, but the actual experience was more abrupt. He woke up in his penthouse at 3 in the morning, and it was all there. The helicopter, the storm, the forced landing in a white field, his pilot shouting at him to stay inside. The pilot's name was Marcus. He had not stayed inside. He remembered walking. He remembered the cold becoming something abstract, like a concept rather than a sensation. He remembered a light in a window across a field, and the only thought in his head stripped of everything else being there. He remembered her opening the door. He lay in his penthouse and stared at the city skyline, and felt the full weight of who he was settle back onto him, like a suit of armor he'd taken off only once, briefly, without meaning to. For 3 days, he told himself the practical version of events. He'd been injured. He'd experienced disorientation. He'd imposed himself on a stranger who had been gracious and kind. He owed her a letter of thanks, and perhaps a meaningful charitable donation to something she cared about. He'd made a note to have Diane handle it. The note sat on his desk, unacted upon. On the 4th day, Ethan Croft, who had built a $6 billion empire on the discipline of doing the next necessary thing, sat in a meeting about a timber acquisition he no longer cared about, and thought about a woman who used too much butter and filled cracks with gold, and had told him 3 true things about himself in a single conversation that his team of paid professionals had never managed in years. He thought about her jaw when she was frustrated. He thought about her hands, clay-stained at the wrists. He thought about the chair she had sat in all night, across from the sofa, watching over him with the focused calm of someone who took care of things not because it was glamorous, but because it was right. He thought about what she'd said in the hospital. When your memory comes back, last night will feel different. You'll want to put it in the category of things that happened to you and move on. She had been wrong about that. He stood up in the middle of the meeting. I need the room, he said. 12 people looked at him. All of you. Out. Please. The please was new. Diane, who had worked for him for 9 years, glanced at him with the expression of a woman recalibrating a fundamental assumption. When they were gone, he sat for a long moment. Then he opened his contacts and found the number Clara had given to the hospital intake form. He had looked it up, quietly, 2 days ago, and not called it, and stared at it every morning like a man who has identified a door and cannot yet decide if he is someone who opens doors or someone who builds walls. He called. 3 rings. 4. He was preparing himself for voicemail, had a sentence ready, practical and measured when she picked up. Hello. Just that. Her voice, slightly guarded, slightly warm, the way a door sounds when it's not quite latched. Clara, he said. It's Ethan. My memory came back. A pause. He could hear what? A wheel spinning. The soft sound of clay. I know, she said. Diane called. She was very thorough. She is. He closed his eyes. Clara, I know what you said at the hospital. About putting it in the category of things that happened and moving on. Ethan, I have tried to do that, he said, for 4 days. I have sat in the penthouse of a building I own, and I have tried to reconstruct the framework that makes that the right thing to do, and I cannot. I cannot find the logic in it. The logic is that you were concussed, and you confused me for someone else. The logic, he said, and he heard his own voice change, not break, but soften in the way of something strong enough to risk softening, is that I walked out of a helicopter in a blizzard, and every instinct I had, stripped of everything I've built and everything I think I am, pointed at your light in the window. And I sat in your house for one night without pretense or performance or armor, and I was more honest with you than I have been with any person in 15 years. And I don't think that was the head injury. Silence. The wheel, somewhere, had stopped. You don't know me, she said finally. Her voice was careful, but not cold. The way a person sounds when they're being careful because they care, not because they don't. I know you used too much butter and beat me at gin rummy once you stopped letting me win, he said. I know you stayed awake all night to keep a stranger alive and didn't ask for anything. I know you filled something in your life with gold because it broke and you loved it too much to throw it away. Another silence. Longer. How do you know about that? She asked. You told me. At 2 a.m. You thought I was asleep. A small sound. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a cry. Something in between the sound of a guard recognizing that it has been standing at the wrong door. I'm in Manhattan, he said, but I have been reliably informed that Vermont is a real place. I would like to come and find out if that's true. The pause before she answered was exactly long enough to be honest. The porch light is amber, she said. Not blue. I want to be clear about that. He was already looking up the drive time. I'll find it anyway, he said. He drove himself. This was not something Ethan Croft had done in 6 years. Sat in the driver's seat. No one in the back. No partition between himself and the decision of which road to take. He rented a car at the edge of the city because his own required a driver, and that felt, today, like the wrong kind of arrival. He drove north through the last of winter's territory, watching the landscape change from the hard angles of the city to the softening terrain of upstate, the long fields white-edged and patient, the sky the particular blue of February light that has given up trying to be anything other than honest. He thought, for the first time in possibly his entire adult life, about what he was doing rather than why it would succeed. He thought about his father's bankruptcy, about the specific silence of a house after you've taken inventory and found it insufficient, about the decision he'd made at 22, deliberate, conscious, architectural, to remove from himself every quality that could be taken from him. Warmth, trust, need. He had built his life on sufficiency, on not requiring anything he didn't control. He had been, the profile said, phenomenally successful. He had walked out of a helicopter in a blizzard, and his stripped, unguarded mind had led him to a stranger's door and called it home. He pulled onto the gravel road at 4 p.m. The snow was crusted now, a week past the storm. The fields settled into the easy permanence of late winter. The treeline was the dark, specific green of spruce and fir, and the road wound through it in the particular way of roads that were made by people going somewhere on purpose. He saw the cottage before he saw the light. It was smaller than he'd retained in his fragmented memory, or perhaps exactly the right size. He corrected himself, and he had simply never learned to recognize that. Stone foundation. White clapboard. A porch with a woodpile stacked with the care of someone who took their winter seriously. And in the window, because the afternoon was already dimming into early dark, the warm amber glow of a single lamp. He parked. He sat for a moment. He had prepared remarks. He had not reached the age of 40 and the level of consequence he occupied without being able to articulate his intentions clearly. He had 3 sentences ready: reasonable, honest, appropriately humble. They would set the right register. They would establish that this was a serious and considered intention and not the residual delusion of a concussed man. He got out of the car, and the cold air hit him, and he breathed it in, not with the alarm of a man who had been lost in a blizzard, but with the recognition of someone returning somewhere after an absence they hadn't known they were serving. He knocked. He heard her footsteps cross the floor. He heard, was it possible? Fig, the traitorous orange cat, make a sound on the other side of the door. And then she opened it, and she was wearing a clay-stained apron, and her hair was up in the unself-conscious way of someone who had been working, and she looked at him with those careful, warm, carefully not too warm eyes, and every prepared sentence dissolved completely. You didn't call to say you were coming, she said. I thought you might talk me.